The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Are you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked. Jesus replied, Do you ask this of your own accord, or have others spoken to you about me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? It is your own people and the chief priests who have handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus replied, Mine is not a kingdom of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my men would have fought to prevent my being surrendered to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this kind. So you are a king then, said Pilate. It is you who say it, answered Jesus. Yes, I am a king. I was born for this. I came into the world for this, to bear witness to the truth. And all who are on the side of truth, listen to my voice. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Did you notice we've gone back to reading from St. John's Gospel? Most of last year, this year, we've been listening to Mark's Gospel, but we've had a few bits where we've inserted some of John's Gospel. So in the summer we had John chapter 6 on the Eucharist, we had John at Easter, and we had a little bit of John in Advent last year. So this passage is taken from Jesus' trial before Pilate. And it's only a small part of the whole trial. It's quite important, actually, quite a good idea to read the whole of that, because it gives us the context and help us to understand the full import of what was being said, who Jesus is. So it starts from it's chapter 18, about the middle, just before the middle of chapter 18 of John's Gospel, and carries on towards the middle of chapter 19 of John's Gospel. That's all the bit with Pilate before Jesus. And remember what had happened. The Jews, the Jewish authorities that is, could only arrest Jesus by stealth, by cunning, and that's where Judas came in. He was a real traitor. He had to come in because they had to trap Jesus in the night, which was an illegal arrest, but they had to trap him. That's why Judas was there. So he was brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and then they took him to the praetorium, to Pilate, where they wanted Pilate to judge him. Well, Pilate said, well, you've got your own laws, get on with it. But what they wanted was to put Jesus to death, and a horrid death, the crucifixion, and the Jewish authorities couldn't do that. So that's why they brought Jesus to Pilate. And in that bit, we see something that is just absolutely mind-boggling. The Jewish authorities brought him up to Pilate, but they wouldn't go into the praetorium. That's the sort of the palace guard, not the guard, the palace where Pilate lived, where he was going to judge Jesus. They wouldn't go in there because that was the house of a Gentile, and it would defile the Jewish authorities, the scribes and the Pharisees, if they'd have gone in there, so they wouldn't have been able to eat the Passover. And just think, where have they gone wrong? What had happened was, they wouldn't go in to the Gentiles' house, so they weren't defiled, so they could eat the Passover. But the Passover was celebrating the very covenant that God had made with his people, with the Jewish people, through Moses. And the whole focus of that was the Paschal Lamb who was going to be sacrificed. So you got a kind of everything turned upside down in that handing over of Jesus to Pilate. And then we have this passage here when Pilate is interrogating Jesus. But you get the sense, when you read the whole of that trial, you're thinking, well, who's really on trial? Is it Jesus or is it Pilate? Jesus is the one who's actually serene in the face of Pilate's interrogation. And he's the one who actually stands in authority, despite the fact that he's in chains, that he's been beaten up basically by the Jewish authorities and the temple guard. And yet he's the one with that kingly serenity. And so this debate then focuses around, who is Jesus? Are you a king? And the kingship of Jesus, right? So Jesus says, are you the king of the Jews? So what's going on? You trying to usurp my position as Pilate? And Jesus really kind of reassures him that this isn't his kind of kingship. His kingship is not of this world, it's eternal. Which draws us back to the Old Testament times. Remember, at the beginning, God didn't give the Hebrew people a king, but he eventually allowed them to have Saul and then David and the Solomon and so on, the other kings, because although he was their king, he was the real king, and it was for the pagans, or if you like the Gentiles to have their own kings because they didn't have the real king, who was God. So Saul and David, Solomon, etc., all stood in the place of God, not usurping his place, but acting with God's authority to govern the people. So there was a divine kingship in a way. So Jesus, his kingship, although he's a descendant of David, his actual kingship is the Father's kingship, God's kingship over his people. So he wasn't really a threat to Pilate at all. Then Pilate asks Jesus an interesting question. He says, well, what have you done? And did you notice Jesus doesn't say what I've done is this, that and the other. I've healed people. He was not trying to defend himself and saying I've done good, I haven't done bad. The allegation of Jesus from the Jewish authorities was blasphemy. Jesus had made himself equal with God. Yeah. Which, if you think about it, was true. It wasn't blasphemy because it was actually true that Jesus is equal with God. He is God. If he wasn't, then the charge would have been true against Jesus, that he would have been a blasphemer. So Jesus gives a very interesting answer to Pilate's question, what have you done? He said, well, mine is not a kingdom of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my men would have fought to prevent my being surrendered to the Jews. So my kingdom is not of this kind. So he's saying, yes, he is a king, but he's not the kind of king that Pilate needs to be afraid of, that any worldly nation, any worldly kingdom needs to be afraid of. He is above that. So Pilate says, so you are a king then. So Pilate is to come into understanding. We've got this sort of discussion around Jesus being a king. Yes, I'm a king. I was born for this. What was this? This is about being crucified. So Jesus' kingship is reigning from the cross. God present in our world as the one who was pierced and died on the cross. And then Jesus comes to a very interesting point that he says. I was born for this. I came into the world to bear witness to the truth, and all who are on the side of the truth listen to my voice. That's where I stopped reading. That's where the passage ends. Can you remember what Pilate replied? Do you remember what Pilate said? He said, truth, what is that? What's truth? And you think, gosh, that's a rather modern statement, isn't it? When we've got a world that's so subjective. We were talking a few Sundays ago, about utilitarianism being, a way of people trying to live their own lives and judge what is right and wrong. In other words, what's right for me is what feels good, what's making me happy. What's good for the world is what's going to bring happiness to the largest number of people. Not truth. It's totally subjective. And so Pilate here is bringing in this very, very modern motif that everything is really subjective. It doesn't matter anyhow. What does it matter as long as you're happy? So he really gets to the nub of it, and then Jesus is saying, no, I'm on the side of objective truth, and anybody who's on my side seeks objective truth. So part of our Christian faith, what identifies us as being Christian, is actually we seek the truth, which is God's presence in the world, an objective moral order. Towards the end then of the trial, Pilate comes out of the praetorium. We keep seeing coming in and out of the praetorium to see the Jewish authorities. So what we see is Pilate brings Jesus out and he says, "Behold your king! Behold your king!" And what did the Jewish people, well, the Jewish authorities reply? They said, "We have no king but Caesar." Yeah? We have no king but Caesar. So, in a perverse kind of way, what they were doing was going back to this idea of the Old Testament. The king is God, who's reigning amongst us. And they turned against that. And they were just about to celebrate the Passover. They made sure that they were pure enough to celebrate the Passover by not entering the praetorium. But the very covenant that they were celebrating in the Passover, the sacrificial lamb who prefigured Jesus, his own sacrifice on the cross, they were rejecting because they only have one king, the worldly king, not the true king. I ask Our Lady today to put Jesus at the centre of our lives as our true king, the one whom we worship and the one who governs our lives.